Oh, the world sure feels noisy and a little unmoored. Same power structures and playbooks, different decade, but same outcomes. What? We need to change the game. But Women Advancing isn't about fixing women. We're busy reorienting leadership for the world we're living in and the one ahead. I'm your host, Kate Byrne. Each week, I talk with the women shaping what's next. Join us as we reset the compass on Women Advancing. Hey, everyone. It's your host of Women Advancing, Kate Byrne. Well, today's conversation is with a true trailblazer in every sense of the word, Gail Burrell Gerry, who's the author of Here to Stay, the story of the class of women who co-educated the University of Virginia. Punchline, this happened in 1974, so not that long ago. And what I think you'll find is that there's such a parallel to what these women experienced through their co-education of the university that is so familiar, oddly so, eerily so, with the workplace. Now, this co-education moment, it didn't just change the campus, but it actually really helped reshape the culture of leadership for a generation of women to come, much as like what many of us are doing inside the workplace. But what's most remarkable about Gail and her classmates is not just the history they lived through, it's the courage they continue to show again and again, whether they're stepping into spaces where women aren't welcome, or using their voices to open doors for those who are coming after them. In our conversation, we talk a lot about what it really takes to challenge the status quo, the importance of grit, to speak up when it would be so much easier to stay quiet, and to frankly stand up and to lead those conversations that others might consider uncomfortable or even taboo. Because as we'll reveal and explore today, progress almost always begins in the same way. Someone decides to speak. So listen in, stay to the end for my KB takeaways, and let me know what you think. All right, let's listen. Women Advancing listeners, welcome, welcome. And I'm really excited to share today's guest, Gail Burrell Gerry, who's the author of Here to Stay, the story of the class of women who co-educated the University of Virginia. The punchline here, everyone, this didn't happen until 1970 with the first co-educated class graduating in 1974. Extraordinary impact by amazing women. Gail, welcome, welcome.
Oh, thank you. It's my pleasure.
Share the story so that people have an understanding of exactly how this co-education came to pass. So the lawsuit, et cetera, so that they have a contextual understanding of just the enormity of this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it had been raised really throughout the history. And there, like in 1920, there was a cohort of women. There were women who were allowed to come in and study, but then they would receive a certificate, but not diploma. There were dispensations made for faculty daughters and sometimes spouses, but by and large, there was huge resistance on the part of a lot of people, mainly alumni. Alumni were the biggest nut to crack. And that's because, you go back to the tradition. This is the way it was. This is the way I want it to be. There's unfortunately, huge population in our country who thinks things were really great back then. And, I would say to them, ask your mother what it was like, ask your spouse, ask some of us who lived those good old years if they were really that good. So the point is, there were lots of committees over the years that were formed and they would only get so far. And finally, at that time, Edgar Shannon decided, he wanted this to happen. And
he had daughters, right?
He had 5 daughters.
5, right.
And I had the good fortune to talk with his eldest daughter, who really she was in 8th grade when we came in. And so she had a pretty good feeling for it. Now, the context to that is Charlottesville schools were just being desegregated. And so she was, 12, 13 years old and going through, the turmoil of that. And then, her dad was bringing home stories of his work. And so she's got some really interesting perspectives of those times. And she said it really was a firm belief on the part of my dad that it could not be a great university without a diverse population. And African American males had been admitted 15 years before in very small numbers, and numbers today still aren't consistent with the general population. And so, that continues, I think, to be an issue, and clearly was one during, my years there. However, he really wanted this. He didn't want it to be an edict. So he put together a committee that had its own issues, including the Mary Washington reps leaving the committee because the committee chair spoke disparagingly about Jewish students and perhaps other things that the tenor was not great, even on the committee. However, it became clear that things were moving in that direction. And at the same time, there were threats of lawsuits. And even though the general counsel to the university said the Civil Rights Act of 1964 does not include higher education, and if we were sued, which isn't likely, but if we were sued, we'd win, which turned out to be wrong on all accounts. So in any event, a woman for women, and with the help of the ACLU, brought suit. And at the same time, a committee was developing a plan that would cap women at the highest would be 35%, and they would be kind of trickling in, and they wouldn't have started when we did. They may not have started for many years. It was a very vague kind of plan, and so they presented that to the judge during the lawsuit, and he looked at it. And at the same time, a man named Kevin Mannix, who was the student body president, had a minority report because student council had originally voted against admitting women, and then they shifted. He gave the judge his minority, or gave the attorney for the four women his report, who gave it to the judge. And when they showed it to the UVA representative, he said, I suggest you guys figure this out because this is going to be embarrassing. So rather than rule against the university, they went back into negotiations and really accepted the whole plan of the first two groups of women would not displace any man. So we were on, and that created issues around overcrowding in the dorms and parking and all of that good stuff. So, there really were repercussions from that particular agreement. However, it, I guess, pacified some of the people who weren't happy about women coming.
So I'm diving straight in because my head still spins when I think about, UVA not admitting women for such a late date. But what listeners also have to know, UVA wasn't the only one. My goodness, Yale and Princeton didn't have women allowed in until 1969.
Correct. Yeah.
Which is crazy. So when UVA first became coeducational, what did it actually feel to even be part of that first class day to day? Inside an institution never designed with you in mind.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, that was really one of my purposes for writing the book, was to get multiple women involved in telling the story. There over the years, there have been some essays and some conferences and some convocations where a few women from my class spoke about their experiences, but it was really a diverse group of women that was admitted with the first class, and we all came with very different backgrounds, and some of us with limited expectations about being first women. We really, I became aware of it, as I tell in the book, because when I applied, I received admittance to Mary Washington, and then a few weeks later, I received a letter to come to UVA. But I don't think any of us, one of my classmates said she really didn't recognize the limits of the women there. How limited we were in numbers until we were walking to the first convocation and during orientation. And even in our class, the first year class, we only made up 18% of the student population. So then you look at the classes beyond us, we were really a minority. And because of the way the scheduling went, many of us ended up in classes that were not, the survey class, and
Right.
we would find ourselves as the only female in the class, or one or two. So I think day to day we were dealing with that. We were also dealing with the fact that we had come from a place where we were the top of our class. I mean, we weren't necessarily the smartest or the valedictorians, but we had to achieve a lot to even be admitted. So all of a sudden you're surrounded by not only smart women, but really motivated and
Hmm.
academic women. And so I think there was a pressure, not only, I didn't feel the competition among us. I mean, we all wanted to do well,
Hmm.
but I think we wanted to make sure we did well because the men were all looking at us. And there was this feeling that maybe we weren't going to cut it. There was also this feeling that it was an experiment. If
Ah,
it didn't work out, then we would, get shipped off or nobody else would be admitted. And so there was that pressure. And I think many of us experienced that pressure in our careers where we might have been for example, I was a high school principal at the age of 34 in a
wow.
big district with 20 other principals, and there was a single other female principal of a comprehensive high school, and she was my mother's age. And so I had a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old. And if they would get sick, I would look at my husband and say, I can't be out. They're expecting
Right.
me to stay home. And I have to show them that they didn't make a mistake by putting me in this leadership position. So many of the women I talked to said it was preparation for life beyond college. The beginning, the first week we were there, I would have to tell you, was extremely difficult because people have used the term zoo-like, but everybody came to our dorms to look at us. And
Yeah.
by the time the upperclassmen came, they were very savvy and they would bring Facebooks and they would walk around looking for a particular woman in a particular room. And it was hugely demoralizing. We'd close
Yeah.
the doors, we'd lock them, we'd tell them don't come, they'd knock and knock and knock. And it was extremely noisy, extremely invasive. Men were out between the dorms playing frisbee and drinking grain punch, which was my first experience, I might add, not really proudly, but it was really a big party. And also we felt included as kind of, someone to look at, someone
Right.
to figure out. Let's figure this out. And
And part of the entertainment,
absolutely. And
right?
that would play out the first semester when we would date or have study dates or, just hang out with men during the week. And then on weekends, we would be by ourselves in the dorms because the routine was you would bring a female student in from one of, in those days, sister schools, which was
Right.
Washington and Mary Baldwin and Stanton and some of the other schools that surrounded UVA. So initially, I would say it was extremely overwhelming because we were finding our footings. A lot of us weren't used to the lack of privacy. And of course, there were urinals in the bathrooms reminding us every single day that this was built for men, not for us. I speak in the book to the lack of lighting, no buses. And we were in the dorms that were furthest from the academic classrooms and the library. And so, it was a challenge to navigate all that. Some of us, and I heard this from some of my classmates, weren't really good at directionality and would get, mixed up, and then they were embarrassed to ask a man, how do I
Right.
get to Cabell, Old Cabell, New, whatever, even though that would have been the logical thing to do. We really wanted to show we could do it. And so that was a pressure. I think that eased after the first semester, and I don't think we knew it at the time, but we know it now that the female midterm scores were higher, grades were higher for both the midterms and the first semester than our counterparts in our class, the males in our class. I think that had a lot to do with just working really hard to prove ourselves.
Yep.
I don't think it was a lack of ability on the part of men. I just don't think they had that need to do what we felt we had to do.
It sounds as though there was this constant pressure to demonstrate enoughness
Yeah,
and definitely
yeah,
worthiness.
yeah,
And I could see you referred to this actually trickling into, future life, just professional life, and how that instills in you this constant, oh my gosh, I've just got to prove, I've just got to prove, oh, I'm so lucky to be here. And I know I'm so lucky, but woof, one fell move and bam, it could go away in a heartbeat.
yeah, yeah. And we were reminded of that. In the less positive moments, men would indicate, even though this is factually untrue, we were accepted on top of the number of men accepted. That was part of the decree that for the first 2 years, no woman would take the
Ah,
place of one of the male students. And that ended after 2 years, and then women were admitted on a gender neutral or gender free basis. But up until that point, when we heard you took the spot of a man who's now in Vietnam.
ah.
And that's getting
About guilt.
into your head because none of us, or not very few of us, I would say, felt anything but awful about men who were serving in that war. It was universally unpopular, and so that was an added guilt when someone would say something like that to you. You'd think, because we didn't know that we were on top of them, had a
And why would you? Yeah.
special group of us. Yeah.
So I have to ask, first off, wow, that makes one's head spin. But I'm curious, what made you to decide to write Here to Stay when you did? Was there something that made you go, okay, now's the time? Because the timing's beautiful, but I'm just curious, what was the impetus?
Well, it's our country right now, our country in 2016 and the lead up. I was really devastated with when the female presidential candidate that were not part of civil language, implying things about her marriage, things about her, talking about her clothes, talking about her looks, talking about anything but her competence,
And
which
marriage.
far exceeded the candidate she ran against, as we all know. But the
Mhm.
point is, I was just so uncomfortable with how it was okay for so many people to be speaking like this when in fact I thought we were past that. And it sort of started to trigger things. And after the election, my younger daughter attended a NOW meeting and came back and said, this was in Northern Virginia, and she came back to me and said, Mom, there was a woman at the meeting who started to cry and talked about being with the first class of women and this triggering this election and all of the hubris around it, triggering just feelings from those days. And I started thinking about that, and I thought, I need to read more about it. So I went to the archives and I went to the library online and I started looking for books. And there wasn't a book that had been written about the coeducation journey. And I'm a wannabe novelist. So if any of your listeners are literary agents and would like to read a manuscript, that's a shameless plug, but I would love to have someone step up. But the point is, I've written before for my career. After a public education, I had a company where I did research and consulting. And so I'm very aware of and experienced in looking at data, looking at documents, interviewing people. and doing a lot of big evaluations. So I started thinking somebody needs to write this book, and maybe that somebody is you. So I put together a proposal, and it was kind of a rocky start. I went through a couple editors at the University of Virginia Press. The academic review process is interesting because you have anonymous readers, and people couldn't really figure out if this book was a history book or if it was multiple memoirs, or, it's definitely a hybrid. And my goal was to tell the human side of institutional transformation. And I wanted the stories. And so it took a while because when I got into the history, some of the history we knew at that time wasn't accurate. So I felt I had to go back and tell that story, the story of the consideration of coeducation and the lawsuit. And then really where I wanted to spend most of the book was with the stories of my classmates. And that was not easy because it was very hard to find a lot of them. And a lot of the emails I had were work emails, and we were right at the point in our careers that some of us were retiring. So, a lot of it was word of mouth. I would do an interview with one classmate, and she'd say, "Oh, you really need to talk to my, former housemate." And I was, able to get a lot of stories and a lot of different viewpoints and hopefully pull it together in a way that makes sense.
Absolutely. Well, I want to touch upon those women because, when you think about it, they weren't trying to be pioneers. All they wanted was to get a stellar education, one that they knew, frankly, before getting there, that they deserved. They had just as much of a shot, and the fact that they had to fight so hard for it. So, how does history change when we tell it through that whole lens of lived experience?
Well, I think one of the things that's been surprising to me, because I've been so immersed in researching and writing the book, and then as it rolled out, talking about it as much as I can, that there are so many people who don't know the story and don't know the history and are absolutely amazed. UVA was the last public university to go co-ed. So, I mean, the tradition of the Virginia gentleman is very, very strong. It continues to be strong. And in some cases, tradition is just fine. But when the tradition is exclusive, when the tradition is a lack of diversity, which we know every healthy ecosystem, the healthier the ecosystem, the more diverse the ecosystem. And a university, any organization is an ecosystem. So bringing that diversity, that the other viewpoints, the other experiences, the other backgrounds, it clearly, according to the men and women on staff and in the professorships that are still there or still alive and talking with me, really accelerated the academic tenor of the whole university. So I think if you just have the numbers, it's not going to tell the story of what that did to actually transform the university. And as some said, made it a new university.
I was just going to say, especially when, to your point, it was so few. How could so few, especially this few who don't look like us, make any kind of real change? And absolutely you did. So, one of the things that I love about this story is that it's not only a story, the situation is that it sits at the intersection of gender power and real systemic change, right? Were there certain leadership qualities that you, as you wrote about and your lived experience with these women, that you all demonstrated? And my bet is nobody called it leadership at the time.
Right.
But, and if they did, they might call you Bossy Bess, or, what I mean? Or she's a few other great words. But were there some leadership qualities that you saw, some common through lines?
So Ernie Erndt, who is still alive and attends a lot of the events with the women in my class, the women got together throughout the years, including the 50th reunion, which was 2 years ago. People have asked him over the years, what were you looking for? And his answer was grit. And if you read Angela Duckworth's work, which is, far later than 1970, but she says that's the single most important characteristic of people who are successful. It's other things that people think of, smarts and
Resilient, yeah.
and appearance even. We do research on what leaders actually, how they carry themselves. She said it's grit, and he defined it as resilience and persistence in the face of adversity. And he said he knew when he was making the choices around who he would offer a spot in this class to, he knew that there were going to be a number, as they say, a vocal minority, and it was vocal, who didn't want this to happen. So women, he knew we would face that, and he wanted to see patterns in our high school life that would allow us to, when we were knocked down, get back up. If our feelings were hurt, because we'd go into a classroom and say, can I sit here? And they'd say no. And so, and that wasn't pervasive, but it happened probably to most of us at some point, that there was at least one or two, or and sometimes multiple occasions where you didn't feel welcomed. And the urge to belong, the need to belong, is a human need. And we found it in each other. We didn't find it some found it in professors, but there weren't many female professors. So if you were looking for a mentor who perhaps had experienced some of what we were experiencing, it was tough because, with the exception of a few tenured female professors, I think the only female I had up until my third year, they were teaching assistants or they were language teachers, Spanish in my case. So, it was definitely in my book. I show the administration we walked into, 20 people who were the top administrators, one female. She was the dean of the nursing school. Yeah. And so, I think in a book I read about Princeton, one woman said, the only thing that changed was us, after her first year. The following year, they admitted 450 at least. We don't know the exact numbers. I can't find documents to support this, but by the lawsuit, it was 450 women plus some more transfers. And the one thing that the history has wrong is there were really 301 transfer students that came in with the 367 women in the first year class. So the difference is they had already had a college experience. So we were navigating our first college experience along these other, social dynamics, if you will. And so I think that's where being in the first class differed from the transfers.
It was really a double whammy in so many ways. So with this, you're women, your cohort partners, and so often in the professional workplace, it's one of those truths that is so frustrating and feels like deep betrayal when another woman doesn't support another woman. Yep. Right? We've all had that, and everyone, I would love it if we stop having that. But did you find that true? Given this sort of us against this crazy world that you found yourself dropped into, did that still happen?
It might have. It didn't happen with me, and I felt more of a support than competition. However, I didn't see graduate school after undergrad school at that point. I'm, the second in a family of 7 children, and so I would have never thought to ask my parents to help me with graduate school. So I knew I was going to get a job, and I was an English major. What I found out later is that many of the English majors were planning to go on to law school. And we had a significant number of women in our class who did go straight into graduate studies and into law school. But that was never something I thought about at that point. So I didn't ever feel like I was competing to be, the top of the class. Now, I met a younger man, not that much younger, a few years later, who went to medical school, not at UVA, but he was applying to medical school. And his whole experience was very cutthroat. And I didn't feel that at all. Now, there may have been, I didn't have women who actually expressed that to me either.
Mhm.
I know they wanted to do well. They wanted to make, their family proud. In some cases, they were first generation. I wasn't. My husband is or was. And so there's that piece. But mostly my sense was of a real collaborative versus competitive experience.
I would just imagine that you're all sort of at any given time looking at each other, asking sort of each other's anchors, if you will, saying, is this really even happening? Just being each other's foundational pillar. We've talked about sort of parallels between the workplace and here. From the form of resistance, which do you think are the sort of would be the most familiar to folks who might feel this way when they're trying to navigate leadership within companies and just their own professional pursuits?
Yeah. Well, I think feeling left out, feeling embarrassed or humiliated. I've talked with a few women who said I never raised my hand because I was afraid my question was a stupid question. We were actually first year counseled not to make ourselves really visible, and particularly with the older professors. I mean, there was a real paradox because in the surveying of the faculty leading up to coeducation, it was overwhelmingly positive. Yet when we got there, a number of the professors really weren't that thrilled about women being there. So we were, a lot of us kind of sat in the back, and, it took a while for us to find our voice. And I think it's so hard because you want yourself to feel. I mean, that's one of the qualities that women bring to the workplace, and men, many men as well. This is not germane to just women, but you don't want to get hardened to
Right.
the world around you. And so to say you've got to toughen up and you can't let your feelings get hurt, because they will, and they will in the workplace. And you're going to have experiences where you think you're the best candidate and you don't get the job. I mean, I know my best interview, I didn't get the job. And so you just have to, there's a saying, it's not how many times you're knocked down, it's how many times you get back up.
Right.
I think that's the grit, that's the persistence, that's the resilience. And truly, it's the motivation to just keep going. And I think there was some of that with our class.
Yeah.
I will never forget coming out of an environmental science survey class with two of my suite mates. And it was a multiple choice, and they handed out the answers as you walked out of the midterm. And my one suite mate looked at it and she said, "Oh my God, I got a C." And she said, "I've never had a C in my life." And I think you have to understand there's lots of twists and turns, and you're still going to get to a place that can be purposeful, can be satisfying, can be happy. And there's life, it just has a lot of possibilities, and you have to be open to that. And I think there's no one way to get to a destination. If you have a goal, you're going to have to find workarounds or other paths if you find one that gets blocked. And I think in my wise old years, that's what I would tell younger people is, don't give up on what you want.
Yeah. And if you don't get it right now, it doesn't mean forever. It means
Exactly.
there's something else. I mean, the way, maybe this is just me trying to make a positive out of a disappointing situation. But sometimes what I've come to do is say, okay, either I'm not ready for it quite yet, as hard as that is for me to believe, or they aren't ready for me. And I think, this is one of the things that you and your classmates really brought to light is, in what ways do you think UVA and higher education still underestimates the long-term impact of women?
Well, I mean, there's still this sense on the part of some that women go to college or to a university to find a husband, that they aren't going to be serious about whatever career path they may be envisioning in those formative years because it will get sidetracked if they choose to have a family or become a caregiver for a person in their family, which is often the women's domain in our society. So women, I don't think, are still taken as seriously around their intent to really be as academic as any other student. And so I think that's hard because that again puts pressure on you to prove yourself. And proving yourself can be exhausting. And, many of us who were in positions in our careers, I think Barbara Savage said it beautifully. She said, when I was working in Washington after college and I walked into a room and she's African American and walk in with all white men, she said, I didn't flinch. I've been there.
Yeah,
I know how to navigate that. And I think that is the attitude you have to take is, I may be the only woman in here or one of a few, but I know how to do this.
exactly. And they may make it a thing, but I'm not going to.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm just
Exactly.
going to eliminate that. I think that's true for a lot of women who are mothers and professionally working as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
So often. So, knowing what you know now, what advice would you give your younger self aside from don't give up on your dream and your passion?
Yeah. Well, I think a couple of things. And when I wrote this book, I wished I had been more intentional about writing stuff down and keeping a journal. And, fortunately, journaling seems to have become something that more and more people are doing, not only to track what your life is like, but to help you make sense of what you're feeling and what's
Mhm.
going on around you and to provide yourself some hope on some of these bad days. And so I did keep a journal. The summer before my final year, I did a study abroad through University of Massachusetts over at Oxford.
Oh,
And
nice.
it was a really wonderful experience. And I found my journal not that long ago, and it's full of terrible poetry and
Ah,
just a lot of angst. And but I if it would have been maybe easier for me to have written this book if my reflections were a little more. I was able. Let me say it this way. I was able to go back and see some of what I was thinking and feeling. Now, I will tell you, I was very fortunate. I moved like 12 times, and some of the material in the book, some of the documents are things that I had squirreled away and I still had. I mean, a copy of the Daily Progress from our first week there, and it has some really interesting things that added to the book. So, keeping things, I'm not encouraging hoarding because my daughters will tell you there's a lot of clothing that I should get rid of and some of I was at an exercise thing the other day and I looked down at my shirt and it was 2020 and the young woman next to me I said, this is older than you are, and she said, well, it was October. No, I was born in August. But so I mean keeping but the memorabilia, and the good news is that they are going to be doing, the archives will be doing a legacy exhibit in 2027. And women in my class and some classes following are encouraged to bring in some of the memorabilia. But I think journaling would be one of them, and also just enjoy the journey. And
mhm.
when you're in it, it's hard because you don't see what's ahead of you. But you have to be comfortable with change because it's going to happen whether you're comfortable with it or not. So get comfortable with the fact that, tomorrow's going to be different from today, and you're going to grow and learn and you're going to make mistakes. And what my daughters always tell me, be gentle with yourself.
Mm. Isn't it interesting how our daughters are the ones who tell us this?
Yeah.
Because I think for the very reasons of this entire conversation, we so often aren't because we feel that mantle of responsibility
Yeah.
for literally opening the doors or keeping the doors open or kicking out a, glass ceiling or all the things. And I'm so appreciative of them
Yes.
reminding us to
Oh,
do
yeah.
that. And thank the Lord that you all have grit and
Yeah.
that you
I have to tell you, reconnecting with the women, both to write the book and seeing some of them in person, just is, I mean, when I first at my reunion got in front of a group, I almost started crying because these are people who stayed the course, and some of them had much greater hardships than I certainly did, financial, and others, some of them thought they were going in one direction and ended up in going in another, what weren't as successful academically as they had thought they'd be because of previous high school experiences. So a lot of really successful women, and I think a lot of really nice, caring women. And I think Dabney in his book said this class brought a greater intent to service, a greater commitment is rather the word I should use, a greater commitment to service than we had previously seen. And I see that with my classmates, and that makes me extremely proud.
absolutely. In fact, it's probably one of the responsibilities that comes with it, especially after living, and I'm going to say surviving through that. It would certainly instill in me, okay, I'm going to make sure to the best of my ability, to clear the path so others don't have to. They're going to experience something of it, but I'm going to try and smooth as many of the big bumps out and support them in any way that I possibly can.
Not only reconnecting with my classmates, some of the current students are finding the book and have done some projects around it and have been contacting me. And that is really very gratifying, because they didn't know the story. They're interested, again, in some of the themes, some of the lessons, how you navigate, because young people are still navigating the world, and always will have that as part of their challenge during their college years. So that's been exciting to me as well.
I bet. And what a great opportunity for these young women, especially to be able to say thank you for making it so that I could actually go to this place in the first place. And then they'll continue to have great impact moving forward and influence as well. Ugh. Well, Gail, thank you so much. Oh, what you've been through. For those of you who are listening and who are in DC, Virginia area, I'm having the great honor of sitting down with Gail and some other UVA students at the University of Virginia's Women's History Month celebration on March 12th, but would love to have you there. In addition, also at the Tom Tom Festival, and later on this year in October, date to come, at the Women Advancing Whole Women's Summit. So keep your ears open. There's going to be a lot of opportunity to get to learn more from Gail and others. So thank you for everything you've done and everything you continue to do.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to speak with you.
Awesome. All right. Until our paths cross in a few weeks.
Yep. See you then.
Gail Burrell Gerry, what a story. She and her classmates, the first women to graduate and co-educate the University of Virginia back in 1974, not that long ago. Thank you, one and all, for your service on that front. So, three key things stuck out for me. One, grit, and grit being defined as resilience plus persistence in the face of adversity. You're going to get knocked down. Take that fuel, use it as just that, fuel to move you forward and prove just how extraordinary you are and show up. Second, don't for 1 minute ever feel guilty over your accomplishments. Be that getting into school, be that getting the promotion, be that getting a seat at the table. You deserved it. You worked hard. You deserved it. And you're not taking it away from someone else. They have another journey moving forward for themselves. And lastly, speaking of journeys, There's more than one path and one on-ramp to what will become your journey. And I know it's really scary when you have your heart set on something, looking and turning up one way. I am an old wizened crone, and it does never cease to amaze me at just how it all works out in the end. I know that's easy for me to say, but it really, really, truly does. And just think about these women who were the class of 1974 at University of Virginia and how their journeys turned out. Each of them a pioneer and extraordinary in their own right. So with that, thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate. Don't be a stranger. Let me know what you think, and let me know who you'd like to hear from next. And let's continue the conversation. Until next time.
Thanks for listening. May this episode inspire you to move forward. Be sure to go to iTunes, Spotify, katebyrne.co, that's KATEBYRNE.co, or wherever you listen to your podcasts, and listen to even more episodes. Here's to strong women. May we know them, may we be them, may we raise them. And be sure to meet them on the next Women Advancing. Till next time.